Well, tonight we'll tackle the controversial aspect of Darwin's theory of evolution, the rapid appearance of animal life 530 million years ago, as we talk about Darwin's doubt with Dr. Stephen Meyer in a moment on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. Dr. Stephen Meyer received his Ph.D. from the University of Cambridge in the philosophy of science, a former geophysicist, college professor. He now directs the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute in Seattle. In 2004, Dr. Meyer ignited a firestorm with a controversy with a biology journal at the Smithsonian Institution, published his peer-reviewed scientific article advancing the theory of intelligent design. He was on with me several years ago as we talked about signature in the cell, his latest work, Darwin's Doubt, the explosive origin of animal life and the case for intelligent design. Stephen, you just keep cutting on the edge there. How are you?
Very well, and it's nice to be with you, George.
You too. You too. This one's taking the world by storm as well, and I think you're spot on. You really are.
Well, thank you. Yeah, we've had quite a buzz the last couple of days just as the book's been released, but it's an exciting time for me as an author, and also I'm really happy to talk about the thesis with you tonight.
Super. Now, when you wrote Signature in the Cell, and you were on with me back about almost 4 years ago, it too, I think, was electrifying as it looked at intelligent design. Darwin's Doubt takes it a step further. Tell me about that evolution.
Right. Well, maybe it'd be good to just review what Signature in the Cell was about, because it was about the origin of the first life, which is a topic that Darwin himself didn't really address. Darwin's theory of evolution attempts to explain the origin of new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms, but it doesn't take on the question of the origin of the very first life, and that's what I looked at in Signature in the Cell, and I argue that the information necessary to build that cell, in particular, is an indicator of prior intelligent design. But many of the critics of the book didn't attempt to refute that thesis per se. What they did was they said, well, look, Darwinian evolution can explain the origin of information, and therefore we don't really need to worry about this. Of course, that Darwinian evolution would come after the origin of the first life, and so it was not really relevant to refuting the argument from the first book. And but the problem is that Darwinian evolution also has problems with explaining the origin of the information necessary to build, for example, the first animal forms, such as appear in this event that I discuss in the new book, the Cambrian explosion.
Let's talk a little bit about Charles Darwin, and where did he come up with these thoughts anyway?
Well, he was an interesting scientist, scholar, and he had been thinking about his theory of evolution for well over 20 years. And in fact, he was prone to some anxiety about releasing his ideas to the world, and it wasn't until 1858, the year before he released The Origin of Species, that he was sort of prompted to do that because another scientist named Alfred Russel Wallace had come up with the same idea of natural selection and had written a friend back in England. Wallace was out in the fields far away from England, and he wrote a friend back home about his idea, and the friend knew Darwin and tipped him off and said, you know, you've been chewing on this for 20 years. If you want to get priority for this idea, you better get it to press. And so in 1859, he then wrote up The Origin of Species in the kind of a blaze of glory and got it out within a year. But the basic idea came from partly from his trip to the Galapagos, partly from his long acquaintance with the ideas that were floating around in what was called then natural history. And he was, of course, familiar with the great natural theologian William Paley, who had the watch-to-watchmaker argument. And as a young man at Cambridge University, Darwin encountered that idea that the intricate complexity of life pointed to a designing intelligence, and he was very taken with that. But then later attempted to explain that appearance, what he was later viewed as an appearance of design, by reference to the undirected, unguided power of natural selection acting on random mutations. So he was very much in that natural theological tradition in the sense that he was trying to make sense of the obvious appearance of design in living organisms, an appearance that biologists today still recognize, but he wanted to explain it as essentially an illusion, as the byproduct of an undirected, unguided mechanism. And if you read the works of modern neo-Darwinists today, they take that same line. Richard Dawkins says that biology is a study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose, where the key word, again, is appearance.
Stephen, did Darwin ever have any doubts about his theory?
Well, he did, that is really the story of the new book. There was one particular doubt that he expressed with some poignancy in the origin of species itself, and it had to do with the origin of the first animals, the geologically abrupt or sudden appearance of the first animals in the fossil record. And he recognized that this posed a kind of challenge to his theory, because he had depicted the history of life as a slow, gradual unfolding of life from one or very few simple forms. And again, he didn't try to explain those very simplest forms, but presupposing them, he said, well, it looks to me as if life has unfolded gradually from that simple beginning, such that he could depict the history of life as a great branching tree, where the trunk or the root of the tree represented that first one-celled organism, and the branches at the top of the tree represented all the forms of life today, and everything in between were the transitional intermediate forms. And that's where the rub came with the origin of the first animals, is that they appeared suddenly in the fossil record without any evidence of ancestral precursors or transitional intermediates. And so the picture of the history of life as depicted by the fossil record of those earliest animals was not tree-like. It was more, it could be more represented as maybe a lawn or perhaps an orchard of separate trees where the roots of each tree didn't connect. They seemed to arise suddenly. In fact, Richard Dawkins, one of the great modern defenders of neo-Darwinism, says that the Cambrian explosion, as it was called, the origin of these first animals in the Cambrian period, looks as if they were just planted there without any evolutionary history, and that was what troubled Darwin.
This explosion that occurred that you talk about in Darwin's Doubt, in your opinion, how did it happen?
Well, I, in the end, argue for the theory of intelligent design, but in a sense, that's the end of the story. What I do in the book is I tell the story of that doubt, that nagging doubt that Darwin had. He had a way of addressing it in the origin. He said that, if we can think of life as the history of life as recorded in the fossil record as a great novel, perhaps, or a great story, he said we only have a chapter recorded here and there, and in some chapters only a few sentences or a few verses. And he said, if we think of life that way, or the history of life that way, the problem of the Cambrian explosion is greatly diminished. And basically what he was saying is that future fossil discoveries would fill in those gaps and document those missing ancestors. And then we would have that seamless picture of the history of life as he anticipated it. Unfortunately, for the Darwinian perspective, what's happened has been just the opposite, and that subsequent fossil finds established an even wider variety of these Cambrian animal forms. In particular, the discovery at the Burgess Shale in 1909 in Canada, and then a fantastic fossil find in southern China that began in the 1980s, and people there are still discovering extraordinarily well-preserved animal forms. In fact, the first fishes now go back all the way to the Cambrian, and they've been discovered in China. So there's just some very complex, fully formed animals with intricate organs and structures on display in these Cambrian beds all across the planet. And so there are, in a sense, more ancestors lacking fossil precursors, and the explosion has become even more explosive.
These mysteries that you also explain in the book, and again, there's no question about it. There's something going on here, some kind of organization, not random at all. I can't see how anybody, once they start investigating this, Stephen, couldn't come to your same conclusion.
Well, I'm flattered by your sympathy for the argument and agreement, but obviously it's a very contentious subject. The one thing I would say out of the chute is that oddly, for those who would object to what I'm arguing, I think they have to now recognize that most authorities on the subject, most Cambrian paleontologists, recognize that this is a very perplexing event. There's two leading paleontologists, Doug Irwin and James Valentine, who also have a book out on the Cambrian this spring. And they argue that this is a real event. This is not an artifact of our incomplete sampling of the fossil record or the inability of these Cambrian strata to preserve, or the pre-Cambrian strata beneath the Cambrian strata to preserve the intermediates. This is a real event that has to be explained. And the review of their book that appeared recently in Science said this is one of the outstanding mysteries in all of evolutionary biology. So whether people want to go with me as far as considering the design hypothesis, that there was some kind of intelligence or guidance behind the process that produced these extraordinarily complex creatures or not, the straight-up analysis of the paleontology, the evolutionary biology says this is a big mystery. This is not what Darwin expected. It's not what modern neo-Darwinists expect. And there's a couple aspects of that mystery as well. One is, of course, the missing fossils. And the other is, how do you build animals this complex? Or putting it a little more precisely, how would the natural selection random mutation mechanism do that, especially when you consider that mechanism, by its own logic, must work very slowly, very gradually on, as Darwin put it, very small incremental variations that would only accumulate over vast stretches of time.
Well, and during this Cambrian explosion period where these animals started appearing, I mean, was it a rapid growth of these animals to the larger, we're thinking more than just some little amoeba floating around in the water. How quickly did they develop?
Well, let's look at it two different ways. The first is just the impressionistic way that a geologist would encounter this. If you think back to that, maybe the Rocks for Jocks class that we all had in college, the first geology class, you remember that as sedimentary layers accumulate, all things being equal, the oldest ones are on the bottom and the youngest ones get stacked on top of those. There's a layer of rock all around the world that is of the same age, the Cambrian age, and the most of the major animal forms, the what are called the phyla, which refers to the classification system in biology, and the phyla designate the largest differences, so they would represent unique body plans. These representatives of these unique body plans came suddenly into the record. And so as you're moving up the rock column, boom, there they suddenly are in several feet of sediment. So it's a very abrupt appearance. Now, from the standpoint of geologic time, that still would represent 5 to 6 million years, and longer. But the major pulse of diversification, or radiation, as it's called, would be in a 5 to 6 million year period. That seems like a lot of time. But it's not only geologically abrupt. I argue that it's biologically abrupt or biologically sudden in the following sense. We have a pretty good idea of how long it would take the mechanism of natural selection acting on random mutations to build things. There's a subdiscipline of evolutionary biology called population genetics that allows evolutionary scientists to calculate how long change or how much evolution could take place in a given amount of time if we know certain things like the generation times, the mutation rates, the size of populations. And as increasingly scientists have made calculations based on those factors, it's turned out that even very small changes, changes in single genes or proteins that would give them slightly different functions, compute incredibly long waiting times. And so when you begin to think about how long it would take to build a whole animal, it's much longer than 5 to 6 million years. And so in relation to the creative capacities of the mutation selection mechanism, the Cambrian explosion is incredibly abrupt, incredibly rapid, and therefore it really generates a deep mystery.
What did other scientists of Darwin's era, Stephen, say? I mean, did they all jump on his bandwagon and agree with him?
Well, most did, because at the time, it looked like Darwin had explained most of the relevant evidence. In fact, I start the book by saying, he thought he had explained every clue but one. And the Cambrian was a kind of nagging doubt, but not one that he took or others took to be dispositive in terms of this long argument that he presented. But he did acknowledge it, and I think that's really interesting and significant, and much to his credit, because a lot of modern neo-Darwinists, and more to the point, people who are self-styled spokesmen for the theory, will often present the theory as something that is completely sewn up and they present it very dogmatically. I was at a hearing of for a curriculum hearing for the Texas State Board of Education in 2009, and they were debating a seemingly non-controversial proposal to allow teachers to expose students to the strengths and weaknesses of competing scientific theories. And one of the contenders, the advocates of the Darwin-only approach in public school science education said, well, you can't apply this standard to evolutionary theory because there are no weaknesses in evolutionary theory. And I presented into evidence 100 peer-reviewed articles written in mainstream biology journals, many of which were written by people working in evolutionary theory who were pointing out weaknesses and problems with contemporary Darwinism. And so in contrast to these kind of overzealous modern defenders of Darwinism, Darwin himself was rhetorically modest, and he acknowledged difficulties with his theory. And these difficulties were also noted at the time, getting back to your question, by some of the leading scientists of the day, including the great paleontologist from Harvard, Louis Agassiz, who was perhaps the greatest naturalist in the world at the time, and certainly the greatest paleontologist. And he knew that there were enormous gaps in the fossil record. And he wasn't at all persuaded by Darwin's argument that the gaps were merely an artifact of our incomplete sampling or searching of the fossil record, because it was a curious kind of anomaly that Agassiz noted. If you think about the tree of life and you think about all the forms that exist today, paleontologists would call those the terminal branches on the tree of life. And Agassiz said, look, the terminal branches of the tree of life are well represented, and the animal forms that we have today usually have some representatives in the fossil record. But he said, but he said that what bothers me is that the internal branches, and especially the nodes, the connecting points between the branches, are unrepresented. And he said, I understand that the fossil record is incomplete, but why is it selectively incomplete, such that the only fossils we're missing are the very ones that we would need to verify or validate Darwin's theory? He said that sounded suspicious to him. So Agassiz went to his grave unconvinced of Darwin's theory. Darwin had sent him a copy of first edition of The Origin, very much hoping to get his endorsement and support, but instead he received a skeptical response. So many of the scientists at the time, especially the younger naturalists, jumped on the bandwagon. But Agassiz held out, and there were other scientists as well who did. It wasn't, as it's often portrayed, a conflict so much between science and religion, but even back then a conflict between the scientists themselves.
Hold on, Stephen. We're back with more Darwin's Doubt on Coast to Coast AM. If you're into the Twilight Zone, you're going to love Beyond Belief this Friday. Mark Zicree, my guest. We're going to talk about the various things that Rod Serling came up with. You can watch it 10 days free. Simply go to our website, coasttocoastam.com, click Hosts at the top, and there it is. Plus, Lex is always highlighting it in the highlight reel, so it's there for you, too. Take advantage of it, and also look at all the free videos available for those 10 days. And welcome back. Stephen Meyer with us, Darwin's Doubt. Stephen, other than scientists like you, Why aren't a lot of scientists today jumping on this bandwagon saying, you know what, Darwin, his theory, it's a little old now, it's not holding up anymore?
Well, actually, that's one of the themes of the book, is that there's a lot of submerged dissent in the biological community, and actually within evolutionary theory itself, there are a number of scientists who have met to explore the need for a new theory of evolution. There's a group called the Altenberg 16 that met in Europe a couple of summers ago with the express purpose of exploring some new approaches to evolutionary theory because they were completely dissatisfied with the standard mutation selection mechanism, and they doubt that the mechanism has the creative power that's long been attributed to it. So in the book, I detail a number of the scientific reasons. In fact, I look at 5 separate problems with the neo-Darwinian mechanism and its inability to generate the kind of explosion of form and also the explosion of genetic information that would be required to build something like a Cambrian animal. And I also look at some of the new theories of evolution that are being proposed, all of which are dissatisfied with the standard natural selection mutation mechanism, and some of which have some great advantages over the standard neo-Darwinian view. But nevertheless, I argue all of these new theories also are subject to the same problem that neo-Darwinism is, in that they do not provide an adequate explanation for the information that is necessary to build an animal. And that, again, that's the second mystery of the Cambrian. It's not just the mystery of the missing ancestral fossils, it's the mystery of the mechanism. It's an engineering problem. How do you build an animal? And one of the ways we know that modern neo-Darwinian theory is in big trouble and has reached a kind of impasse is that there are so many new theories of evolution being proposed in an attempt to solve that fundamental mystery, the mystery of animal morphogenesis, as it's called. How do you build one of these things? I have a fossil with me right here in the office where I'm speaking of one of these trilobites that first appeared in the Cambrian. And this fossil is so exquisitely preserved, you can see the little structure in the compound eye of this organism. And a compound eye is a fantastically complex visual apparatus. And we have these amazing systems present in the first animals from the very dawn of animal life. It's just extraordinary. So,
sure. Is that what is on the cover of Darwin's Doubt?
Yes, exactly. There's that creature you're looking at. I was fascinated with them when I was a little kid. The trilobites. They're obviously very different than anything we have roaming around our seas and oceans today, but they're also obviously very complex animals. And with lots of anatomical structure, articulated body plans, and these extraordinary eyes. Again, right from the dawn of animal life. And so that's an engineering problem. How do you build something of that integrated complexity as a compound eye? We know that part of the answer to that question must involve genetic and other forms of information. And so when we think of the Cambrian explosion, all those animal forms that first arise in the fossil record in the Cambrian period, we're not just talking about an explosion of new forms of life. We're talking about an explosion of information, reams and reams of digital code stored in the DNA molecule. And we now know that there's other forms of information in living systems as well that are necessary to build animals. And that has to be accounted for. And that's what many evolutionary biologists are now grappling with. And it's one of the reasons that I would say that neo-Darwinism has come to a place of impasse. And again, you know that because there are so many new ideas in circulation, none of which have gained anything like universal assent or affirmation in the biological community, and I would argue all of which are also subject to the same problem in that they can't explain that necessary code, that necessary information, also what's called epigenetic information that's not stored in the DNA but still is necessary to build an animal. So it's a big problem, and it makes a very interesting time to be engaging this question.
In this time period, when did mankind plop down, and how do you explain that?
Well, human beings are much, much later. People always ask me about human evolution, and I can give a layman's opinion like anyone else, but I oddly work the other end of the time scale. I look at the origin of the very first life, which is dated at about 3.85 billion years ago, a very, very long time ago, and then the origin of these Cambrian animals is about 530 million years ago. Human beings come on the scene much, much later, and depending on whom you ask, anywhere between maybe 1.8 to several 100,000 years ago, or tens of thousands, depending on how people assess the human origins. But I'm at the other end of the time scale in terms of hundreds of millions, and in the case of the origin of the first life, which was the subject of my first book, billions of years ago.
Now, when humankind began to pop up on the planet, how do we explain that? I mean, when we talk about intelligent design, are we talking about the God factor here?
Well, let's talk about. Let me explain what the theory of intelligent design is about. Let me do it first in the context of the events in the history of life that I have studied most carefully. There is, a number of people have asked me, well, okay, so you have this powerful critique of neo-Darwinism. The fossils don't support the pattern of appearance that Darwin expected. The mechanism doesn't seem to have the creative power necessary to generate the information you need, certainly not as fast as it arises in the Cambrian explosion or other similar events. So, how do you get from there to the idea that some kind of intelligence is involved in the process? And oddly, the way I got there was by studying the works of Charles Darwin himself. Not only his theory of evolution, but I was specifically interested in the method of scientific reasoning that he used. Because if you think about these questions of biological origins, you're not talking about events that can be replicated under controlled laboratory conditions. In other words, you can't do the normal kind of bench science and make a trilobite appear all over again or replicate the first life on Earth. These are singular events that can't be repeated in the laboratory. So the kind of science you're doing is a different kind of science. It's more of a forensic science or an historical science where it's trying to infer what happened from the clues that are left behind. You're functioning, Darwin was functioning as a kind of detective. And that doesn't mean that his methods of reasoning weren't scientific, but they were different kinds of, it was different kinds of scientific methods that he used. And the method has a name for it. Geologists call it the method of multiple competing hypotheses, or some philosophers of science call it the method of inferring or inference to the best explanation. And the idea here is that if you want to explain an event in the remote past, you have to try to explain that by reference to causes that are now in operation. That's actually a phrase that Darwin got from, or Darwin was aware of from his own mentor, the geologist Charles Lyell. The idea is that you want to explain an event in the remote past by reference to a cause that you know is sufficient based on your present experience of cause and effect. So I like to use the example here in Washington State. We've got this layer of white powdery stuff all across eastern Washington. And if a geologist were to come upon that, not knowing about the May 18th, 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, and try to figure out, well, what caused this feature of the first few layers of topsoil in eastern Washington? He might propose a number of different causes. He might have a number of possible hypotheses. Maybe it was a flood, maybe it was an earthquake, or maybe it was a volcano. Now, which of those three is the best explanation? Well, applying Darwin's criterion, the best explanation is the one that we know from experience can produce the effect in question. And that effect, in this case, volcanic ash, is we know produced by volcanic eruptions, but it's not produced by floods or earthquakes. So we can infer from the effect back to the cause because we know something about the cause and effect patterns or structure of the world. And I got into studying Darwin's method of reasoning, and then I began to wonder if that method of reasoning couldn't be applied to this crucial question of the origin of information, the information necessary to produce, for example, Cambrian animals. And I came across an important work in the early application of information theory to biology, to DNA. and it was written by a man named Henry Quosler, and he made an offhand observation that for me just made the light bulb go on, or the nickel drop, whatever metaphor you want to use. And he said that the creation of information is habitually associated with conscious activity. And I thought about that for a bit. I already knew that people trying to explain the origin of life had come to a dead end because they couldn't come up with mechanisms that would account for information. Trying to explain information from chemistry is kind of like saying that the ink on a piece of paper the chemistry that keeps the ink bound to a piece of paper is responsible for the Shakespearean sonnet or whatever it is you're reading there. Chemistry and physics alone don't explain information. There's way too much of it to come about by chance, and so as I looked at the different options, I knew that the materialistic attempt to explain information had failed. But I realized there was a cause of which we know from our ordinary experience, from our uniform and repeated experience, which, as Darwin taught, is the basis of all scientific reasoning, that is capable of generating information, and that cause is intelligence. It's mind. It's conscious or rational activity, as Quosler put it. And so I realized that by using Darwin's own method of reasoning, we had a cause. We knew of a cause that from our present experience that could account for these infusions of information we find in the history of life. And that led me to conclude and to develop a rigorous scientific argument for intelligent design. Scientific in the sense that the argument's based on scientific evidence and discovery, and the argument is using the very same method of reasoning that Darwin himself used. So if you want to say that the case for intelligent design is unscientific, you've got to also say that Darwin's theory was unscientific, and I don't think anyone really wants to go there. So that's the positive logic that leads you to think that a designing intelligence played a role in the origin of the Cambrian animals or the origin of the first life.
How can some people conclude that there wasn't any intelligent design at all? That's what baffles me, Stephen.
Well, this goes back to the other aspect of Darwin's work, and again he was very brilliant. Though at this point I diverged from him. I used his method to come to a non-Darwinian conclusion. Darwin wasn't just arguing that life had changed over time. Many people had said that, and that sense of evolution is something that nearly everyone accepts. I, of course, accept that life has changed over time, that it's different now than it was a long time ago, and that there are minor variations within the limits of a gene pool, for example. So that kind of that meaning of evolution is not contentious. But what Darwin did was try to show that the process or the mechanism of evolution was undirected and unguided. He was actually arguing against design. And I have an illustration that kind of shows the logic of his case. This is embedded in the structure of the argument in The Origin of Species. He didn't use this example, but he used examples like it. I just find it easier to explain it with sheep. If you imagine you're a sheep herder in the far north of Scotland, and you want to breed a woollier breed of sheep, what do you do? Mm-hmm. Well, this is well known to ranchers back to biblical times, or farmers, herders and ranchers, and certainly was well known in the 19th century. You choose the woolliest males with the woolliest ewes, and you allow only them to breed. And then in the next generation, you get a slightly woollier set of offspring, and then you repeat the process. Wash, rinse, repeat. You just keep doing it over and over again.
Right. Keep calling out the other ones.
Yeah,
right?
And after many generations, you get a very woolly breed of sheep. Now, if you're in the far north of Scotland, you have a kind of animal now that is well adapted to the cold climate. And one of the things that impressed biologists in the 19th century with evidence of design was how well adapted organisms were to their environment. That was seen as the primary evidence of design in the 19th century. If you're looking at a fish, it's got gills and a swim bladder and a lateral line and all these wonderful complex adaptations that allow it to live in the water. You look at birds, and they have wings and beautiful feathers, and their equipment suits them to the place in which they live. And what Darwin did, at least with examples of minor variation, was suggest that striking appearance of design, namely adaptation, could be produced by an unguided, undirected process. Instead of needing an intelligent agent to guide the artificial breeding, he proposed that, let's go back to my sheep example, something like this. What if there were a series of very cold winters such that only the various woolly or the very woolliest males and females survive, then wouldn't at the end of that process you have the same outcome, a much woollier breed of sheep? But now that's occurred not because of the guidance of the rancher or sheep herder, but instead it's occurred because of variations or changes in nature, changes in the environment. So instead of intelligent selection, we now have natural selection. And so for Darwin, his argument for the natural selection was actually an argument against design. He was trying to show that natural selection was a kind of designer substitute. And of course, the question is not whether natural selection can produce small-scale changes, make sheep a little woollier or less woolly, or finch beaks a little longer or shorter, but it's the really pressing question in modern evolutionary theory is whether it can produce the big stuff. Can it produce sheep and birds and Cambrian animals in the first place? One biologist put it, natural selection does a good job of explaining the survival of the fittest, but not the arrival of the fittest. The origin of fundamental form, of fundamentally new forms of life, and the complex organs that they possess, and also, I would argue, the origin of the information necessary to produce all that stuff, that's where I think that the mechanism runs into trouble, and where I think his argument really fails as a substitute or as an alternative to the design hypothesis.
Do you think if Darwin were alive today that he would change his theories?
You know, that is one of those questions that I often get, and I really don't know how to answer it. I think I would have myself. I would love to have the conversation with Darwin, because I profoundly respect the reasoning that he used, the way he pioneered this forensic or historical scientific method, and the way he marshaled his argument. He had the British, the Anglo-Saxon mind is very good at shaping arguments, and he wrote the Origin of Species, as he put it, as one long argument. He tried to marshal all the data and make a coherent sense of it. And I would love to get him in a room with a dozen or so scientists that I know and have the conversation, because I think the evidence now points in a different direction, and for every argument that he presented, there's now an evidence-based counter-argument that is, I think, very strong to the thesis he proposed of descent with modification by natural selection. And also, there's a lot of new science that we've learned since 1859. Darwin himself had no theory of genetic inheritance, or the theory he had actually was inaccurate. He didn't know about Mendel's work, and he didn't know about certainly Watson and Crick and the discovery of the digital code in DNA and the role that plays, all the wonderful things that we've learned in the second half of the 20th century under the heading of the molecular biological revolution, and certainly now in the beginning of the new century with the Human Genome Project and the ENCODE project and everything we're learning about even what we once thought to be junk DNA is now turning out to be functional. So I think there's just a tremendous amount of evidence that points in the direction of design, and I'd like to think that Darwin, because of the kind of mind he had, would be open to that. So I guess that's my answer. It's really hard to speculate.
Stephen, if people want to get the book, which it's now out, where do they go? Amazon, bookstores?
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, the usual online booksellers. I've been told by the publisher, Harper One, that the Barnes & Noble has in-store displays now in 300 of their stores with the book prominently featured. And then I have a website, darwinsdoubt.com, which allows you to click through to purchase at any of those sites, but also gives you a lot of other information about the book and the background to the story.
Okay, we're going to come back more as we talk about Darwin's Doubt on Coast to Coast AM. And we're talking about Darwin's Doubt, the explosive origin of animal life and the case for intelligent design. All you got to do is go around and look at every animal creature you can find on this wonderful planet and scratch your head and go, there's got to be more behind this. We're going to be back with Stephen Meyer on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to our next hour with Stephen Meyer, author of Darwin's Doubt. Stephen, where do you think Darwin went wrong?
Well, given the context of what he knew, the theory that he developed was, I think, very reasonable in its time. I think actually the doubt that he expressed in the origin was the central problem, and at the time it looked to him to be kind of a minor anomaly, one little thing that he couldn't explain in comparison to all the other important things that he could explain. But it turned out, with the benefit of hindsight, that the problem of the Cambrian explosion was not just a problem of missing fossils. It was also the more fundamental problem of the origin of biological form and structure itself. There's an important book published by MIT Press in 2003 discussing the unsolved problems in evolutionary theory. It was called On the Origin of Organismal Form, and in the first chapter, the two evolutionary biologists had a little table in which they listed the unsolved problems confronting evolutionary biology. One was the Cambrian explosion, but very near to that in the table was the question of the origin of form. And I remember seeing, when I first saw that, and I thought, this is really significant. It's in a little chart in a technical book, but the problem that the question that Darwin was attempting to explain was the question of he said the origin of species, but that's another way of saying the origin of the new forms of life, the new body plans and structures that arise in the history of life. And if leading evolutionary biologists today are acknowledging that the problem of form is unsolved, then we're really back to pre-1859. And I think that was so. I think that's really. It was not so much that he went wrong, but that he misjudged what was the most important question and what were the lesser or minor questions. His mechanism of natural selection and random variations explains minor variations and adaptations very well, but it doesn't explain the fundamental, the origin of fundamentally new forms of life. And oddly, the leading evolutionary biologists are coming around to the realization that question is still unsolved. There's one British paleontologist, Simon Conway Morris, put it in a recent article. We're in a post-Darwinian world.
Tell me what you believe is the difference between, or similarities between, intelligent design and creationism.
Oh, that's an excellent question, because we're often accused of being people who advocate intelligent design, like I do, are accused of being creationists in cheap tuxedos and other things like that really hurt our feelings, But there's two important differences between the theory of intelligent design and creationism. The first is the method of reasoning itself. The creationism is either an interpretation or a deduction from biblical authority. It's usually a particular interpretation of the early passages of Genesis. The theory of intelligent design is not attempting to interpret Scripture. It's rather an inference from biological evidence. And so the method of reasoning and study is completely different. The basis of the theory is evidential rather than religious. And secondly, creationism, as it's typically referred to, especially in a pejorative context. If you get accused of being a creationist, usually what people mean is that you're ignorant of the evidence for the great antiquity of the Earth and the universe, and you think that the Earth was created 6,000 or 10,000 years ago. And intelligent design is not addressing the issue of the age of the Earth. It's addressing the question of whether or not there's real design or merely the appearance of design, as the Darwinians say. And so we're not arguing for a young Earth. I myself believe that the Earth is billions of years old and the universe even older. So that's not an issue for advocates of the theory. And those are two really important differences. But opponents of the theory of intelligent design like to throw the term creationist around in a pejorative sense to try to discredit our work and our ideas. So they will routinely refer to us as intelligent design creationists, as if that itself constituted something of a refutation. But of course, they're conflating two things in that terminology, and they haven't really even addressed when they try to refute the argument by name calling. They haven't really addressed the substance of the argument that I and others are making.
You know, as we look at intelligent design, and you look at the metamorphosis of life, is it conceivable that from the cellular level, Stephen, it has its own ability to create and manifest and do what it does?
Well, that is a very interesting idea. First of all, I love your choice of words, metamorphosis, because there's a new video out about the butterfly and the evidence of design in that process of metamorphosis. It is stunning, and I would give a shout out to the producers of that film, Lustra Media, and turn some of your listeners onto it. It's definitely worth a look if you want to see evidence of design at a macroscopic level in a beautiful organism. But the other idea you allude to in your question is the idea that maybe there's a kind of capacity within cells to respond to the environment. And there is a very interesting new theory of evolution that's non-Darwinian that's been developed by a molecular biologist at the University of Chicago named James Shapiro. And his idea is called natural genetic engineering. And he, in studying the way in which cells respond to the environmental stresses or cues from the environment, notes that mutations, when they occur, are not random. They're often directed in certain ways to generate certain kinds of responses. And there's a kind of if-then subroutine at work in a lot of cells. He says they're under algorithmic control, and that there's a pre-programmed adaptive capacity built into many cells and organisms. And I think that's a really intriguing idea. It's certainly non-Darwinian. The question, and I think some of the processes that Shapiro points to are clearly real processes, and I think we have to take that into account. So I think that's an interesting body of work and ideas. The question I have, of course, and I think it's one that leads back to the conclusion of intelligent design, is where does this pre-programming come from? It may be that organisms have a capacity to respond and evolve within limits in response to various environmental clues and triggers, but where does that initial pre-programming come from? I think that for a person that sees evidence of design, I think we would see that as a locus of design. That's where you would say, this gives evidence that there was a designing intelligence involved in this, in the origin of these systems.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it's an amazing paradox of trying to weigh, the various aspects are out there. One on the religious end, Stephen, we have people who purely believe that a godlike figure, waved his magic wand and all this happened. And then we have our other thoughts on just what this is. Where does the universe come in?
Well, that's a fascinating topic that takes you back even further in the time scale, because the great discovery of modern cosmology in the 20th century is the universe had a beginning. And this was something that no one expected. At the end of the 19th century, the universe was thought to be eternal, self-existent, and everything else was thought to be the product of undirected material forces. So it was eternal, self-existent, self-organizing, and self-creating. And that view of the origin of the universe, and with Darwin's theory and other things in the life sciences, the view of the origin of life, gave rise to a kind of philosophy or a worldview, a metaphysical system that scholars call scientific materialism. It was the idea that science supported a view of the universe and of everything that had unfolded within it that suggested that matter and energy, acting on their own, undirected by any purpose, any intelligence, could produce everything we see. And even the universe itself was eternal and self-existent, so it didn't need a cause beyond it to bring it into existence. And I think all of that has changed. I think that that worldview or metaphysical system is now being challenged on many fronts by developments in many fields of science. And in the area of cosmology and physics, you have the cosmological evidence with the Big Bang theory and the way in which it dovetails with Einstein's theory of general relativity. You have evidence for what's called a singularity at the beginning of the universe. And then in physics, starting in the 60s and 70s, physicists began to discover that we inhabit a Goldilocks universe, that all these fundamental parameters or fine-tuning features, as they're called, of the universe are delicately balanced to allow for the possibility of life. So things like the expansion rate of the universe, or the particular strength of gravitation, the gravitational force constant, or the speed of light, or the mass density of the universe, all these features that could be otherwise, could be different, turn out to have very precise values that allow for the possibility of life. And so when you couple that evidence of design with the evidence of design that we see that emerges later, once life comes on the scene, I think you have a very compelling case for design overall. And in my way of thinking, it points to designing intelligence beyond the cosmos, not within it. If you look at just the evidence from biology, you could say, well, maybe this is evidence of some kind of immanent intelligence, some agent within the cosmos. But when you look at the evidence from physics and see that there's evidence of fine-tuning from the very beginning of the universe itself, clearly no agent within the cosmos could be responsible for the fine-tuning, the design, evidence of design in the very fabric of the universe itself. And I think that suggests that we're looking at an intelligence that does point beyond the universe. And so I favor a theistic take on the design hypothesis, though obviously some of that goes beyond just the science into an area of philosophical deliberation.
Schools, of course, teach Darwin, but they don't teach intelligent design. How come?
Well, the dogma is, and I'm talking now about the dogma in science itself, and this is in some ways a byproduct of the Darwinian revolution, but since the late 19th century, scientists came to think that it was part of their duty as scientists to explain all phenomena by reference to purely materialistic causes, undirected materialistic causes. So even if you're looking at questions like the origin of life or the universe, you can't consider what is an obvious possible explanation that some kind of mind or intelligence played a role in the origin of those systems. And I would go further and say, even if you're looking at information or circuitry, both of which things we're finding in cells and in whole animals, and both of which are, in our experience, indicators of intelligence, in that only intelligence produces those types of phenomena. Even in that case, you can't consider intelligence as a cause. And so I think there's the problem starts in science itself, or at least late 19th century science, as we've inherited it into the 20th and 21st century. There is many scientists perceive that there is a rule that prevents them from considering intelligent design as an explanation. They have to limit themselves to matter and motion, to purely materialistic explanations. And yet we know from experience that there are all kinds of things that we do not explain by reference to molecules knocking into each other or by mutations and natural selection. You go to the Badlands and the Dakotas and you see Mount Rushmore, nobody wants to say or will infer, no rational person will infer that was produced by wind and erosion. You're clearly looking at something that was produced by a mind. And so part of the argument we're having about intelligent design and strict neo-Darwinism is about the rules of science. And our argument is, look, scientists ought to be free to consider whatever hypothesis best explains the evidence. That's the method that Darwin pioneered. That's the method that's used broadly in science. Let's not put artificial restrictions on what the best hypothesis might be. Let's let the data determine that, and let's follow the evidence where it leads. Now, when you get to the question of public education, what's going on there is that textbook writers and others think that they need to look to the scientific community and to the alleged consensus within the scientific community. And I say alleged advisedly, I'll come back to that, but they look to what they perceive as the scientific consensus, and they say, look, scientists say that Darwinian evolution is the explanation, that there are no alternatives that are being considered, so that's what we must teach. But what they're not seeing is that the consensus around Darwinism is, A, much more fragile scientifically than people realize, and you see this when you get into the technical literature, and B, the absence of alternatives, or at least the alternative of design, is a byproduct of this artificial rule that has been that has evolved and developed in biology, which I think limits the freedom of the scientists to follow the evidence where it leads. And we think we advocates of intelligent design think that the fundamental obligation of the scientist is to do precisely that, is to follow the evidence, even if it leads to a conclusion that might be uncomfortable or challenged a long-held philosophical prejudice, like the idea of scientific materialism, which I was discussing a minute ago. So what's going on in public education is really a byproduct of the perceived normative procedures that many scientists feel they must accept and follow. It's not, I think, a reflection of the actual state of the evidence.
I don't think as a parent, I would have been upset had the schools taught intelligent design along with Darwinism. I think that's healthy, don't you?
Well, what our approach in public education is to say let's teach the controversy. You don't teach if there's a controversial issue, and this applies in history class or involved when you look at political issues. You don't teach one. If you're a history teacher and you're looking at the New Deal during the Great Depression, you wouldn't just teach the Republican critique of Roosevelt's policies, nor would you just teach the arguments for those policies. You teach the controversy. You teach what both sides had to say about it as the chief proponents would make the arguments. And that, I think, is a good general approach to pedagogy whenever you encounter a controversial issue. Now, we've made a prudential decision at Discovery Institute not to advocate for the teaching of our theory in the public schools. We don't think there's any constitutional reason that's valid that would preclude teaching about intelligent design. Intelligent design does have larger metaphysical implications, but so does neo-Darwinism. But both of them are theories that are attempts to explain biological evidence. But right now in our current climate with church-state jurisprudence and the way people interpret the idea of separation of church and state, any idea that has implications that might be friendly to theism is viewed as an imposition of the church or theocracy on the unsuspecting science students of America. So if you start teaching about intelligent design, and I also highlight that word about, a good teacher doesn't advocate a dogma or a doctrine. The teacher will teach about competing theories. But even if a teacher simply teaches about intelligent design, it's likely right now in this climate to end up in court. And we're trying, as a group of scientific researchers, and that's my colleagues at Discovery Institute, but also the scientists around the world now. There's an international research community that is working on developing the theory of intelligent design. We want to develop this case at a high academic level and stay out of courtroom cases such as occurred in Dover, Pennsylvania in 2005. So what I advocate for public education at this point in our cultural evolution is teach Darwinian theory, but also teach the criticisms of the theory as they appear in the current peer-reviewed scientific literature. And there are many supplementary texts that allow teachers to do that. That keeps you clear of any battles in court, because it's really at that point just a matter of scientific literacy. If you can know the arguments for Darwinian theory, why can't you know the criticisms that are occurring and appearing in high-level technical journals? That's just good science education. So that's what we propose for public education.
Okay, more to come with you, Stephen, when we come right back on Coast to Coast AM. Well, we're always looking for you to sound off, and you can send your sound off to editorial at coasttocoastam.com. Make it about a minute's worth. Include your name and phone number. We'll get back to you, possibly record you. Here's this week's Sound Off.
Hi, I'm Mary from Portland, and this is my sound off. Nothing makes me madder than people who honk their horns when they're out on the road. People use their horns in anger, and it's not right. If I'm driving down the road and going the speed limit, then there's no reason for someone to start honking as if I was going at a snail's pace. Look, we all have laws to abide by, and people that honk at others so that they can go faster than is legal, well, they should get tickets and pay heavy fines. The roadways are supposed to be a safe place to get from A to B, and not a place where people can speed and cause accidents. I also get upset when I see people honk at pedestrians and crosswalks. They have the legal right to cross. And the people who honk at them, also, they deserve to get tickets. I'm Mary from Portland, and that's been my sound off.
Stephen, when you think of life on this planet, of course, you look at every animal. They all have eyes, ears, a nose, a mouth. I find that alone to be fascinating and subject to intelligent design.
Well, yeah, when we talk about biological form, that sounds a little bit like an abstraction, but the thing that's puzzling about the Cambrian event to many scientists is what they call the origin of body plans. And a body plan is a unique arrangement of body parts and structures, and so the integrated complexity of such organisms is really what needs to be explained. There's a chapter in my book where I look at something that I find personally really fascinating, and that is the discovery in the last 30 years of what is, in essence, a form of integrated circuitry. They're called developmental gene regulatory networks, and scientists have discovered that for an animal to develop properly from fertilized egg to full-blown animal, it has the different types of cells that develop during that process have to be differentiated one from another, and they have to be organized so that you get the right types of cells in the right types of places. You want the muscle cells and where the muscle cells should be, and the gut cells where the gut cells should be, and so on. And in order for that to happen, there's a whole network of genes and signaling molecules that the genes produce that come online in very specific time-sensitive ways. It's all choreographed. And these choreographed networks of signaling molecules and the genes that produce them literally form an integrated circuit. And that circuitry is absolutely necessary to developing the animal properly. Now, this is one of the big problems with the neo-Darwinian attempt to explain the origin of these Cambrian animal forms. If you want to build if you want the evolutionary process, if you envision the evolutionary process of building a new animal body plan from a pre-existing body plan, you need to have some new circuitry. You need to have new developmental gene regulatory networks. But what we've discovered, what scientists have discovered, developmental biologists have discovered about these developmental gene regulatory networks is that if you alter them, if you perturb them, they have catastrophic effects on the development of animals. And that makes perfect sense from an engineering standpoint. And this is why I say that one of the big mysteries associated with the Cambrian is essentially an engineering mystery. We know from engineering that the more functionally integrated a system is, the more difficult it is to perturb any part of the system without defect to the whole. It's called the constraints problem in engineering. And animal development is subject to that constraints problem. If you alter these circuits that control the development of animals, the effects are catastrophic. Development shuts down, the animal dies, and that raises a huge question for neo-Darwinism. If you need a new circuit from an old circuit to get a new animal form, but you can't change the old circuit without catastrophic effects, how do you ever bridge that gap? How do you get there from where you were at the beginning? And that's just one of the several problems I discuss with the idea that the neo-Darwinian mechanism is truly creative or creative enough to build a body plan, which is what arises in the Cambrian period. And again, and then the body plans would have all those intricate parts you're talking about. So the complexity of life has just at every level amazed us. First, it was the Watson and Crick discovery of the genetic code. Then we realized that there were other forms of information, what's called epigenetic information. Now there's the realization that there's this kind of circuitry controlling all this. And all of these things, by the way, are attributes that we associate with design systems. And so that earlier question you asked, I think, is really apropos. Why is it that people are resistant to this idea? Typically, as I begin to explain the case for intelligent design with scientists who have a materialistic mindset, it sounds to them like I'm talking a foreign language. But if you step back and realize that inside animals we have all these distinctive features that we associate with design and with engineering and with intelligent causes and no other type of cause, I think your question becomes really poignant. Why not what's holding us back from making the obvious conclusion that one way or another, whether slowly or gradually or suddenly, intelligence must have played a role in the origin of these complicated animals.
They had to, absolutely. So when you were putting Darwin's doubt together, anything surprising to you?
Well, in some ways, what was surprising is I wrote a bigger book than I expected. The more I got into the topic, I'd spent 25 years, actually about 20 years researching the question of the origin of life before I finally wrote Signature in the Cell. And I'd been interested in the Cambrian explosion. I've been doing work on this back to, you mentioned at the top of the interview, the paper I wrote in 2004 for the Proceedings of the Biological Society of Washington, the journal published out of the Smithsonian Institution's Natural History Museum. So I've been interested in this topic for a long time, but I intended to write a shorter book. And as I got into it, I just found that there was the wealth of evidence, first challenging the creative power of the Darwinian mechanism, and then secondly, in support of the design hypothesis, it was even deeper and richer than I anticipated, and I also wanted to write the book as a mystery story, and around basically the story of the book is the story of it's the story of Darwin's doubt and what's become of it, and the story was bigger than I expected it to be, and so it was kind of an exciting process. And last fall, as I was finishing up the manuscript, I ended up probably writing a few more chapters than I had expected, but it all came pouring out at the end, and so it was a fun process.
Let's talk about Darwin's doubt, and of course, why does it even matter?
Well, I think it matters, and by it now I mean the question of biological origins. And I've done debates and had lots of conversations and discussions with people on all points of the compass in this issue. There's the classical neo-Darwinian point of view. There's the advocates of these various new theories of evolution, self-organization, some punctuated equilibrium, and I look at 5 or 6 others in the book. And advocates of intelligent design and old line creationists, and the thing I often say is that whatever a person's point of view about this issue, I always feel a kind of personal kinship with somebody who cares about this issue, because biological origins and cosmological origins, these questions that come up in science, are scientific questions to be sure. But they are also questions with profound metaphysical, philosophical, worldview, if you like, implications. In other words, they're the big questions. They're the questions that every human person has asked. I mean, every thinking person has asked these questions since the dawn of history. How did we get here? How did life get here? Is there any purpose behind our existence? Is there any purpose behind the universe? I sometimes like to say that you can't have a purpose-driven life if there isn't a purpose-driven universe. And so people wonder, could there be a purposive intelligence with a purpose for us behind everything we see? And the debates that go on about the origin of Cambrian animals or the very first cells or later forms of life that emerge are really surrogates for that deeper philosophical discussion that humans have engaged at least as far back as the ancient Greeks. Is the fundamental reality mind, or is it matter? And the Greeks had the two schools of thought. They had the atomists who thought it was matter, and then they had the people like Plato and Aristotle who were advocates of the mind first idea. And that's been an ancient and perennial human discussion. And what I find fascinating is that late in the 20th century, after the questions seemed to be all sewn up, and after scientific materialism had become ascendant and seemed to be the dominant view of those who were in the scientific know, we have had a remarkable shift in science itself that is now in many different areas of science pointing in a different direction. I mentioned earlier the evidence from cosmology for a definite beginning to the universe. That's a difficult thing to explain from a materialist standpoint. Carl Sagan used to say the universe was all there is and all there ever will be, and And yet we now know the universe had a definite beginning. Even time and space had a beginning. And that points to the need for a cause beyond the physical universe. It's very difficult for a materialist to explain the beginning of the universe from matter itself, when matter itself seems to have had a beginning, a point of time when it came into existence. So then you have the fine-tuning evidence in physics, which is just extraordinary, which I think points to a designing intelligence. And then you have the evidence of it's a stop-press moment, I think, in the history of biology when Crick realizes that not only is DNA this intricate double helix structure, but he proposes what he called the sequence hypothesis, which turned out to be true and was confirmed by many experiments. That was the idea that the chemical subunits along the interior of the DNA molecule are storing information in a digital form. Those subunits, called bases, are literally functioning as alphabetic characters in a written language or digital characters in a machine code. Their precise arrangement carries instructions for building all the proteins and protein parts that cells need to stay alive. So we have digital code running the cell at the foundation of life. What a powerful indicator of if we've got code, if we've got a program, we must have a programmer. And so the mind-first view, I think, is again coming into currency. And so you have developments in science that are raising these ancient philosophical questions and then pushing us in the direction of an answer that at the close of the 19th century seemed to lack credibility entirely.
So the court case that you had mentioned last hour, tell me a little bit about that.
That was a train wreck. It was Dover, Pennsylvania, 2005. Very tiny school district in central Pennsylvania decides that they want to compel teachers, first mistake, to read a statement at the beginning of class, letting students know that there's a textbook that advocates or explains the theory of intelligent design in the library. Letting students know about a book in the library was pretty innocuous, but compelling teachers to do that, I think, is the wrong approach to public education. I think academic freedom is an important principle, and one that we at the Discovery Institute and I know most advocates of intelligent design think has got to be part of the way we proceed in the discussion. So that was a mistake. But there were also the school board that did this was actually a group of I don't think they really knew very much about intelligent design. There was a number of people on the board who were proponents of young Earth creationism, and I've already explained the difference between the two theories. And I think they were trying to use intelligent design to make their theory seem more credible or to give it cover or something. In any case, at one of the hearings where the proposal was being debated by the school board, someone rose and spoke in support of it, making a very explicit religious justification for the theory. And we knew, looking at the transcript, that there was no way that any court in America was going to allow this to go through. And we also knew it was going to visit upon our scientists a huge amount of media scrutiny and a fair amount of kind of hostility from colleagues who didn't understand what the work on intelligent design was all about scientifically. And pretty much everything that we feared happened in the case. The law was struck down. It was struck down in a way that, as it was reported in the media reported it as a loss for intelligent design. People on the other side of the issue, the staunch neo-Darwinists, started kind of gloating, saying it's over after Dover. There's no, the court had found that intelligent design had no basis in science. Now that's where I think the thing went really off the rails, because of course we don't look to federal judges to decide important scientific matters. Still less do we look to them to decide deep questions like the origin of life or the origin of Cambrian animals or the origin of the fine-tuning of the universe. This is, as another judge put it more modestly, this is above our pay grade. But so we had this odd spectacle of the courts by first deciding the constitutionality of this specific provision. And the base of the narrow finding was that the school board offered an explicit religious justification for their policy, which contradicted something called the Lemon Test, and so they struck the law down. Fair enough, and we saw that coming, and we thought the way the school board went about their proposal was, completely back-asswards and counterproductive to what they were trying to achieve, and was likely to result in what it did. But then the judge in the case went a lot further, and people commenting went even further and tried to say that the court had settled the scientific issue, which clearly it didn't. And I think what's happened the first couple of years after the case, there was the sense that intelligent design was a spent force. But now there have been so many books and films and peer-reviewed articles coming out in mainstream journals, and the development of the scientific research community internationally. There's a huge British group now that is the Center, CENTRE, for Intelligent Design. There's a new peer-reviewed journal, Biocomplexity, with a prestigious editorial board of scientists, including members of national academies in their own countries. This is an idea that isn't going away, and this court case in this little backwater in central Pennsylvania is not going to decide the central scientific and philosophical issues around this issue.
Well, you keep doing what you're doing, Stephen. We'll keep getting the word out, and we shall see what happens. We're going to take phone calls with you next hour.
Fantastic. No, I appreciate the chance to talk to your audience.
Well, it's a great subject. What about state legislatures? Anything going on there?
Yeah, and there we have some much more constructive things that we've been able to have a hand in. There are academic freedom bills that are being adopted in states around the country, and this is where our federal system is really a healthy thing. States are allowed, they're the laboratories of democracy, and a lot of state legislatures have said, hey, we want to protect teachers and their academic freedom to explore these questions in an open way. And we have authored some model legislation or proposals that can also be adopted by state boards of education. We're still steering people away from getting into the intelligent design issue. With that 2005 case, it's almost a provocation to litigation, and we want to keep teachers out of that. But what we are saying is, look, let's protect the freedom of teachers to explore the strengths and weaknesses of Darwinian theory. Let's allow them to talk about both the arguments for Darwin's theory, but also the counter-arguments. And in doing that, by the way, we're not doing anything very different than what Darwin did in The Origin of Species himself. He was in the British tradition of the rhetoric of science. He was making an argument, but he also was opening up the discussion to his readers and telling them about the counter-arguments. That's what Darwin's doubt is all about. He had doubts, and he expressed them. And let's let students know about those scientific doubts as well. That's part of what's going on. So these academic freedom bills are I think, a really positive development in American public education. There have also been state boards of education that have adopted policies that encourage teachers to teach strengths and weaknesses or teach the controversy. And that's just a healthy way to do science. It allows students to turn ideas around in their mind and look at things from different points of view. And that's a stimulating way. It encourages interest in science education.
Sure does. We're coming back with phone calls next.